Say if you're joining us from other time zones. Thank you for coming today and joining us virtually. I'm Roger Strong, Vice President for Academic Sales at GAIL, and we are so excited to have you with us for what is the third installment of Behind the Screens. Today, a great topic, one that I'm sure, as we've seen the movement from remote and hybrid, from physical to remote and hybrid learning, something that's at the forefront of everyone's thoughts, and that's intersectional teaching approaches, specifically around primary sources. So before I get started, just a couple housekeeping notes. We will be recording the session today, and so that link will be sent out to registrants following the session. The other thing we would ask is if you do have questions during the session, do include them in the Q&A chat function within Zoom. And we will have a chance at the end to answer those questions that you may ask. So we look forward to receiving those. So without further ado, I did want to let you know of our special guest today that will be taking us through a conversation around intersectionality in teaching. First, we have Dr. DeMuth, Danielle DeMuth from Grand Valley State University. Dr. DeMuth teaches a variety of courses within LGBTQ studies. She is the faculty director of the WGS Study Abroad program to South Africa, and her research interests include lesbian and queer literature and history, and she has long-term research accomplishments on the trajectory of lesbian literary theory and history, as exemplified in the case of GAIL Wilhelm, who wrote We Too Are Drifting, the first lesbian novel in the United States. Also joining us today is Sarah Tarpley, our Director of Academic Product Sales. Sarah is a member of our leadership team managing sales channel readiness and strategic customer initiatives, and she assists all of our customers as we look at becoming more supportive of the use of GAIL content on campuses. So without further ado, I will kick it over to Sarah. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Roger. So this is going to be a conversation. So Dr. DeMuth and I are simply going to chat, and hopefully we will reveal some interesting insights for you all. We encourage you to follow along, and if you do have questions and answers, or questions rather that you'd like to pose to us, do feel free to submit those through the Q&A box, and we will entertain those towards the end of our conversation today. So let's see, just want to make sure that we have Dr. DeMuth and I spotlighted here. Okay, I'm seeing just Roger, so okay, there we go. Dr. DeMuth, it's so good to see you, and thank you so much for taking the time and joining us today. I feel like a good place to start. I always find it more interesting to hear from the panelists themselves a little bit more about your background. So if you could maybe start by letting our audience learn a little bit more about you. Would you share some details with us about your background, as well as a bit about your research interests and the courses that you're currently teaching?
Yeah, so my background is I have a PhD in English, and I've been teaching women, gender, and sexuality studies for probably about 25 years, partly through the interdisciplinary methods, but also my background being in the humanities, being in literature, that shines through what it is I do. So yeah, so I've been teaching at Grand Valley now for I think 14 years. Living in Michigan, and my research is specifically on, Roger mentioned GAIL Wilhelm, who published the first lesbian novel in the United States in 1934. So I've been doing a lot of archival work specifically on her. You know, there's not a lot out there, but more as more things become digital, it becomes easier to gain access to information. So I teach a lot through this lens of curiosity, and my own curiosity as an example to spark the curiosity in students.
Right. So, I mean, given that your research does include lesbian and queer literature and history, and the fact that we know that the study of humanities can successfully foster and build cultural competence, how do you leverage your research passion in your approach to teaching? I
think this idea of understanding history and kind of even understanding that the story that we're told and the story that it's conveyed to us and that we sort of come to assume is the only story actually has a lot of missing pieces to it. And being curious about what that looks like, being curious about what it is we're missing, and being able to sort of dig through and uncover more parts of the story is something that really appeals to students. And that's what I do in my research. So as we start to unpack, so when I teach literature, we talk a lot about the American story, the origin story, and what it is we think we know. And the more we add diverse voices to the story and to our perspective, that story starts to shift and grow. And that is very appealing to students.
Yeah. Tell me, with the courses that you are currently teaching, are there non-traditional humanities students enrolled in those courses? Tell me a little bit about the composition of who actually enrolls in your courses.
Yeah, well, so in my women, gender, and sexuality studies courses, there's sort of a balance of students who are taking courses for general education credit, and then students who are like majors and minors in women, gender, and sexuality studies, and the same for the English classes that I teach as well. So you've got a really nice mix of students who are there for honestly for different reasons. And in my women, gender, and sexuality studies classes, I have a lot of students who are from business and nursing and allied health sciences, statistics, all kinds of students with a curiosity for, the meaning even of the work that they're doing and how understanding different voices and different perspectives can help them be better at what it is they're planning to do, including working in the health field, including the meaning of statistics and understanding political science. And then a lot of students who are teachers, especially in my English classes, and who are really themselves thinking about how they want to present information to the students that they will be teaching when they graduate.
Great. Yeah, that's so important. I mean, I think the role that the study of humanities and social sciences play in the lives of students that are enrolled in business, as a business major or maybe a health sciences major, there is still importance there and significance to what they're learning from you in terms of various issues as it relates to sexuality, gender, social justice, et cetera.
Right. And a lot of it has to do with hearing from different people, hearing different people's stories. So, putting the news aside or things that they're even learning in their classes that seems very factual, when you start to understand how different people tell their stories and what's important to them, it really does shift things. It really humanizes things. And then you end up, focusing on a lot of questions around critical thinking and trying to understand those things that can be just very valuable no matter what it is students are doing.
Yeah. So as we see an increased need for intersectionality pedagogy in the classroom, what conscious considerations have you made in your course design and teaching approach?
Yeah, so focusing a lot on this idea of curiosity, whose stories are being told and whose stories are missing, it is a really key part of that, right? So when I'm putting together a syllabus, I try to include as many voices as I can, but we still run up against the question of who is missing. And so training students to look for who is present, who is missing, what questions aren't being asked, that is really the key thing. So in putting together a syllabus, trying to show them that some of the things that are sort of assumed, like the wage gap for women and what women are making as compared to men, is only a tiny piece of the picture. You have to add more components. African American women, for example, Latinx women, for example, that pay scale changes. So again, asking more and more questions about whose story we're telling and which pieces are missing.
Yeah, very good. Now we're all dealing with with the pandemic. Have you had to re-engineer any of your teaching approaches due to COVID?
Yeah.
Yeah, where do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's been obviously a real struggle for everyone, students included, to adjust to so much of the teaching happening online and trying to manage time and tasks in a way that's productive. Losing some human contact has been, one of the things that students are telling me about, feeling like even the students in their, the other students in their classes, they don't know them and they don't feel that connection. So finding ways to build connection with students and getting them to talk to each other is particularly challenging. Fortunately, I've been teaching online for a while, some of my classes, not all of them, but some of them, and I've had success in helping students build connections with each other. So carrying that forward has been really helpful. I'm really glad that I had been teaching online some before this started.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, it's a whole new world. So it sounds like your experience, you're really leaning on that now. Um, have you done certain things with your courses? Any tips for our audience in terms of how to make your class more engaging? Just due to the fact that people are kind of seeking out those more natural in-person connections. Have you experimented at all, or
Yeah.
any tips to offer there?
Well, there's an overwhelming amount of tools out there that you could use. Um, Padlets and Flipgrids and ways to incorporate video so that you can see the students talking, I think is really important. Things that don't have to be consumed all at once, that they can do in pieces, I think is making a big difference. Um, Other things that I've always done, like assigning them to groups, has been sort of valuable because when they have a group task, they end up finding ways to connect with each other when they are tied to each other in that way. So they'll have group chats and FaceTime and those sorts of things to talk to each other, which is really interesting to see. But I also find that it's been important to not um, schedule things that have to be done at a certain time, that they have to be working on in a certain time, that they can contribute their pieces to when they can, because I have lots of students who are now at home with their kids, and they're having to manage their children's schedule as well as their own. So they've got to work in bits and pieces.
Yeah. It's really just kind of, employing some humanity, right? Understanding the stressors that everyone's kind of going through. So that's great that you're able to, adapt your classes in that manner. I'm sure your students are grateful for that. So talk to us a little bit, switching gears, sort of talking about your own personal primary source research endeavors. How have they impacted the way in which you introduce primary source materials to your students? So, you have this great experience in your research with your publishing, using primary source materials. So what has been your approach to introducing primary sources to the students that you teach?
Well, what I learned a lesson probably about 10 years ago from our liaison librarian at Grand Valley. She's at Western Michigan now. But one of the things that, as we started to get more sort of invested in this idea of assessment and understanding stages of student learning, realized that we had been overwhelming students. And when I say we, I mean lots of faculty, just overwhelming students by throwing them into databases with just vague questions or key terms, and not really getting that the very first skill in information literacy is finding a known source. So something you already know is out there, learning how to find it. And what a lot of us have been doing is just sort of throwing them into any database with, just very vague, or what is your question? What is your topic? And it wasn't very systematic, and it was very overwhelming. And so this idea of really pulling back and thinking about what are the skills that they need to build and how can we scaffold them so that in the very beginning, make them feel comfortable with a small task that's manageable. And then, throughout the curriculum, or even, throughout the course, but really throughout the curriculum, building on that. Mm-hmm. So learning this idea that start with teaching them how to find things is really important. And so in the case of using primary sources, they don't know often what a primary source is or how primary sources are being used by scholars, how primary sources are being used in, research for even popular culture, material that they consume, that people do that research and how they build it. And so really focusing in on helping them see what a primary source is, what that looks like, how it differs from secondary sources. And so presenting them, rather than sending them into a database to just look for things, they don't even know what they're going to find. Show them what it is they might find and talk about how to use that is a very basic first step, I would say. Later, you can start throwing them into databases and helping them develop questions. But to start there is overwhelming, and it can be fun. There are students who already have that sort of curiosity and like to do that, but it can also be very overwhelming.
Yeah. So once you've kind of set that tone, right, and you've introduced them to, the library databases and kind of set them forth for looking for something that they already know kind of exists, what kind of primary sources do you actually use in your courses? And tell us a little bit about how you choose them and where you access them from, right? Are you going through the library? Are you relying on the library's resources? Do you have some in your own coffer somewhere? What kind of things, artifacts, and primary sources are you using?
So especially starting out with students, some of the things that they might have already heard of, maybe read about, I think are a nice place to start. So I'm teaching a class right now called Foundations of Feminism, which is really about not just feminist theory, but also feminist history. And so one of the things that it's out there, it's easy to access, is the Declaration of Sentiments. And so they've heard about it, maybe they have read it. So we could go in and look at it and take a close look at that document and think about who signed it, what were the conditions under which they signed it, where was it signed, and I've been there, to Seneca Falls, so I can show them pictures. But then to take that, especially building on intersectionality, to take that and put that in context with the Combahee River Collective statement, which is all African American women's voices, and to then put those two things together and think about if the Declaration of Sentiments had incorporated more voices, what might it look like? How many of the things that they talked about in the Declaration of Sentiments are actually reflected in the Combahee River Collective Statement, and sort of building a comparison with those documents that they have probably heard about and looking at them as primary sources. And then what questions can they ask about those things if they wanted to do further research on it?
Yeah.
I think that answered your question.
Yeah, no, the comparative analysis with primary sources is just so eye-opening. So I'm definitely engaged. I want to enroll.
Yeah,
Sounds
and
good.
some of the other things, when I'm teaching literature and teaching lesbian and gay and queer literature, looking at letters and looking at, photographs from the authors and trial records and different things like that, that give them a little bit more, rather than telling them the story, help them to discover a little bit of it on their own.
Great. So conversely, you're well seasoned in terms of introducing the primary sources in your courses, but have you come up against some challenges in using primary sources? Locating them from disparate collections, locating them from sort of like unwieldy large, archives, having time to find, the right primary sources, especially now given the demands of, your online teaching schedule and everything that you have to sort of reconfigure due to this new teaching approach. What have some of your challenges then in terms of locating primary sources?
I would say over time, one of the biggest problems has been access, right? So, teaching literature, one of the easier things to access are, documents and archives of famous authors, right? So if I wanted to use material from Virginia Woolf, I could easily do that. But when you're studying authors, and maybe not so much the sort of bisexual and lesbian aspect of Virginia Woolf's life too, right? But when you're working on lesser known authors or that there hasn't been as much interest in, it is difficult to find the material. It has over the course of time been even difficult to know that certain material was somewhere. But as archives have come online, even just cataloged and things have been growing, it's been easier to find them. But even then, when you find them, I have traveled so many places to spend, weeks in archives to gather material. And that travel right now, obviously we're not traveling to archives, but it's even difficult to travel in regular times because it's time consuming and expensive. And students can't do that, for a project. So access has definitely been an issue over time, but also who's important enough or interesting enough to be archived. Our families, especially with lesbian and gay and queer folks, our families, donating their material to libraries for archiving, or are there elements of homophobia there that keeps that kind of access to that material more difficult? You know, how much has been destroyed? So that kind of thing.
Yeah. Um, you know, another thing, you sort of touched on it earlier in our conversation, but you had alluded to kind of things that are transpiring in the media. So I was just curious. There is a lot of social injustice being documented that we're working through in today's society, unfortunately. You know, how has sort of the media the attention that the media is drawing towards social injustice issues, how is that impacting the assignments that you're giving to your students?
So one of the things that is so wonderful about college students is not only their curiosity, but their optimism
Mhm.
and their drive and desire to make a contribution for change, whatever that is, right? So they're seeing these things happening and they see themselves as being part of the future solution. And their curiosity and passion is such a wonderful tool. And to pair that with assignments that show them how these things have been done and have transpired in the past, I think is really important, so that they can learn lessons about organizing, for example, from good and successful and less successful examples from the past is helpful to them, as guides, as problem solving tools, and also when you can see the things that some things that have changed, it also is hopeful, right?
Mhm. Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. So one thing we haven't yet disclosed to our audience yet is the fact that you actually have been partnering with GAIL on a product that we have recently developed. You're actually the editor-in-chief for our intersectional LGBTQ issues module that appears in our GAIL case studies product. I'm curious about that. How did you become involved in GAIL's case studies product?
Well,
And tell me a little bit about kind of like the role that you play in the development of the content that kind of goes along with the case studies product. And then maybe we can show our audience a little bit about that and kind of how you use it. So go ahead, sorry.
yeah, so I was actually approached with this sort of idea that you all were looking at how can we make the archival material that you have available more accessible to, especially to teachers, right? Especially to instructors who are trying to use this in the classroom. And the idea was there are, millions of documents, right? So many folders, so many, and material for in the archive already, material from lots of different sources, lots of libraries and archives, lots of different kinds of sources, letters, documents, government documents, meeting minutes, photographs, newspapers, periodicals. And the idea was to think about, 10 topics that could be case studies of their own, and to sort of draw with this idea of introducing something in that's a little bit more digestible, a little bit more accessible, pulling documents from the archives that help to tell this kind of story and make it accessible to students, frame it in ways that are intersectional, ask questions about it. So I was really excited about that because I really love looking through archival material, and I have been very passionate in thinking and looking at ways to show students different kinds of activism. That was definitely something that I was already trying to do. And what activism looks like, there's sort of, the kind of activism where what you do is you contact your senators, and there's a kind of activism where you might storm the Senate, right? So the difference between that kind of activism and what people have accomplished. So I went into the archives, and I can just, picture myself deep into the night for many months, going through archives, gathering material, and kind of coming up with the things that I knew students were curious about generally, but that didn't know existed. So topics they were interested in, but they didn't know the material already existed. And so dug through and gathered those things together, and organized organize that material, organize the photographs that are accompany it as well, and questions that I think would be good guiding questions for students when looking at that material.
Yeah. So maybe we should give our audience a preview of kind of what that looks like. Let me see if I can bring it up here. So this is the GAIL case studies product that Dr. Demuth was just elaborating on. So if I go into the cases, so for this first module, of which you're the editor-in-chief, this is the intersectional LGBTQ issues, and you can see the 10 different cases that you've worked on here, Dr. Demuth. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about kind of the connections that you can make with your students with the cases that you've put together, and maybe we can kind of poke around here a little bit and sort of illuminate to our audience kind of, you know, how you would use these or how you're using them to engage your students?
Yeah, so you'll see there's sort of a range of things that are issue-based. So, and also very and critical even now, like things the students have questions about, like employment discrimination, like immigration, like violence, right? So those are pretty big topics that haven't gone away. And they involve national organizations, they involve local campaigns, right? So against moves to ban cross-dressing. They involve education, so the rainbow curriculum that happened in New York. So topics that students are already interested in and have questions about, and then making connections that are tell a story of a moment in time. So, you know, trying to get the rainbow curriculum to include LGBT families, trying to get the connection between immigration bans on people with HIV and other immigration bans that were happening. We're thinking a lot about immigration now as well, and so putting that in context with each other. And then also thinking about, again, different kinds of activism. So the anti-cross-dressing laws example, that happened in California, but this is something that happened all over the US. So this example is actually from California. And what was happening at the time was they were banning people from wearing more than 3 articles of clothing from the other gender. And using that to raid bars, we're using that to round people up, right? And so, but it was also targeting sex workers, and it was targeting trans folk, but it was sort of impacting a lot of people. And so this move to strike anti-cross-dressing laws in California is an example of the kind of very local activism that was happening through the city council to try to end discrimination based that way. So I grew up in Toledo, and actually in Toledo, the same sort of thing happened.
Sure.
And so this is sort of a basis what students could do with this, learn about how this worked here, but then also do local research. So what happened in your state, what happened in your city, what happened where you were from? Are any of these laws still on the books? How did people in your community end them if they did?
Mm-hmm.
I think so that's a pretty digestible, nice example of activism, people working together, politicians working together with activists. A less nice, I would say, example, but it's my favorite, is actually the example of ACT UP and their Stop the Church ZAP. So it's an example of direct action activism that was happening that involved coalitions, not only of ACT UP and AIDS activists, but also reproductive justice activists, to stage a die-in in the cathedral in New York against the kind of anti-sex education work that the church had been doing. It was a very controversial action, and most people would just kind of react to it. But what happened and how many people were arrested, example. But what this particular case study shows you is all of the planning that went into that ZAP. And I think that's one of the things that students don't necessarily know. Like, you see what happens, you might see examples of direct action activism in the news, and people respond often very negatively to the work that activists do. And they don't even see what was the work that they did in order to accomplish this. How many months of meetings and planning and backup plans and contingency plans went into place to make this happen. So this particular case study includes meeting minutes. It includes responses in newspapers, for example, and all of that sort of thing that students can look at. Okay, not just how did people respond to it, but what was the planning that went into it? What were the kind of reactions from other members in the LGBTQ community as well?
Mhm.
So that's kind of my favorite one, honestly, especially because it's so controversial, even with activists, that they felt they went too far having a die-in in a church in the middle of a mass.
Yeah, definitely. And so do you find, so the way the case studies kind of are shaped in the product, in the finished product, thanks to your help and your craft, you actually have the case study. So you've got case study background and then the text of the case with some photographs and visuals, which you've selected that will sort of depict or bring to light the cases for students. And then you have those primary sources kind of serving as almost as artifacts, wouldn't you say? To kind of help students better understand exactly kind of what was, as you stated, happening behind the scenes, right? How did this activism, come about? And so these are actual exhibits that you can use to engage the students. And then I like your thought about, how does this, were there similar points of activism locally? What, these discussion questions are sort of guideposts to think critically about the case and the primary sources that have been presented. But the idea is that I think what you were saying is like you can augment them, right? So, when you make something more local, I think people feel it. They feel a little bit more passion behind it. So any other thoughts about, using these case study packages or the discussion questions in your courses? Any thoughts or ideas about sort of implementing a tool like this?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are multiple ways you could do it. I think one would be to start with one case study in common that every one of the students looks at, studies, asks questions with each other. But then I think a great idea like they could then be put into groups and sent to the other case studies and report back to each other what they find, sort of based on which ones are of interest to them and what their questions are. So in the example of the Stop the Church example, once they learn how things like this are planned and what kind of disagreements come up and in terms of implementing and how things work, lots of students think about they want to do their own activism, and some of them want to do this kind of activism. And so my hope in, not only in history, also learn how to do it themselves if they want to, right? So it isn't that you just get this idea and you put it out there. You need cooperation, you need to build collaboration and coalition with other people, and you need to think about, who is, one of the things that scares a lot of students is this idea of maybe getting arrested, right? So when you kind of look at, well, how did they plan for that? How did they protect people who were in a position to do that? What kinds of things did they learn? That kind of helps them plan that. Lots of students are not interested in that kind of activism whatsoever. So if they wanted to work with their local city government on whatever kinds of activism, the anti-cross-dressing, the actions against anti-cross-dressing, which were collaborative in a different way using the government, how did they do that? What kind of arguments did they use when building sort of bipartisan agreement around ending those anti-cross-dressing laws? How did they do that? What kinds of arguments did they make? How did they petition? How did they work together? How did they compromise? I think that can be really interesting, and the students will, asking them those questions that come with the discussion and having them share what it is they observed, I think is a really important way to do that.
Yeah, definitely. So one thing that you had mentioned to me early on was that you felt like the GAIL case studies could serve as a launch pad for increasing students' appetite for consumption of primary source materials. Can you describe for me the significance that GAIL case studies offers for launching students into primary source collections available through the campus library?
Yeah, so I think having these case studies really makes it possible to show them what is possible. So there are millions of documents, and just throwing them into the archive without any guidance could be overwhelming. Seeing these smaller cases and showing them what can be done with them can help them develop questions. So the sample questions that can help them as they build their observations, and then realize what it is they can learn by studying these things helps build questions for them. They don't know what they don't know, and they don't know what questions sometimes even exist. And so using this to help them build their questions can help then guide them into the larger archive where they can then search, so we show them what exists and then help them learn how to search for more things.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a huge consideration. And I think as we were designing the product too, I'm just going to bring it up for a second here. When we were designing the product too, we actually thought about that. So if we, do a search or search for information on a particular topic, one of the things that we've done is we're allowing students to obviously investigate those primary sources, but then they can broaden their search. They can go directly out to the library's other primary source collections from GAIL. And that's where, that curiosity peaks, and there's a bit of serendipitous discovery where you can actually extend that same search and get into numerous, primary source collections that are likely to already be available in your library potentially, where they can kind of extend their search and navigate things like, oh, that's interesting that cross-dressing is showing up in slavery and anti-slavery. I wonder what that's all about. And so I like that idea, that sort of like, that development of the inquiry skills, I guess you should say. But yeah, that's a wonderful, wonderful approach.
And they can also narrow that down by looking just at what was happening, what was being said in newspapers, and so they can narrow it down even by types of sources to see. Yeah, and that's what we do for them, with them.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's great. So tell us a little bit more about your relationship with your campus library. As an instructor, a researcher, how have you partnered with your library?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier this sort of lesson about information literacy, which can only, I think, be taught to us by librarians. They get this, and sort of learning what that scaffolding looks like. And so, having a liaison librarian that you work with closely in terms of building assignments and locating material, and right now just sort of working with them an idea. You could tell them what an idea that you have, and librarians are the best because they are so curious and so excited that they, in every case, I learn so much more about what's possible from them. And so I have worked with, our librarians, and I think lots of librarians are sort of even expected to do research. So we've worked together on presentations for conferences, specifically on teaching information literacy and scaffolding it over the curriculum, over assignments. So it's a really productive relationship that improves what is happening in the classroom. That collaboration is really amazing.
That's fantastic. Yes, we love our librarians.
Yes.
So one last question for you before we open it up to our Q&A. So audience members, if you do have questions, feel free to type those into the Q&A box for us. But the last question that I have for you is that in 2010, you received the Pew Teaching Excellence Award at Grand Valley State University. What advice do you have to offer to others on today's call on how best to engage students? Because it sounds like your students love you. So talk to us a little bit about that.
I think really listening, curiosity. I tell them very clearly, my teaching philosophy is on my syllabus every time, and it's about curiosity and compassion and what it is it means for them to claim their education, and letting them know that I take them very, very seriously, and I want to talk to them and learn what they're curious about. And even just exactly what librarians do, when you tell them what you're curious about, they refer you to so many things you didn't know existed, and help you make those connections. And that is what I also do with students. So listening to what they're passionate about, listening to the questions they have, and directing them, brainstorming with them. I think that's really important. So it's sort of some things you can plan and some things you can't, but you can only get to them by building those relationships and listening to what it is they're really interested in, and helping them see how important it is for them to claim that, that they're here, not to be. So Adrienne Rich, I always start my classes with an essay by Adrienne Rich called Claiming an Education, and how important it is that they are not passive receptacles of information, that they are really there to claim what is rightfully theirs. And what it means is taking them seriously. It means that they take themselves seriously, but that they have a right to be taken seriously. And that's usually a very good place to start. They many times haven't heard of themselves thought that way.
That's fantastic. That is fantastic. Wonderful. So I see we have a couple of questions in our Q&A box. So Roger, do you want to relay those back to us?
Yes, sure. And great discussion. Thank you both. So the first one is around identifying resources that are primary sources about key racial landmarks. The question is, I've been surprised by student suggested input reflecting on racial disparities this fall. Have you attempted to identify resources that are primary sources about key racial landmarks, such as images of lynching, reports on Tulsa, Rosewood, studies of medical abuses, such as informed consent failures? So could you talk maybe more, Professor DeMuth, and Sarah as well, maybe on, was that are you also looking at, and I know that's kind of outside of the scope of maybe LGBTQ, but is related, obviously, when we talk about intersectionality and maybe some of those things that you're looking at?
I think one of the things that's so amazing about the whole archive is that material is out there, and that those connections can be made. And I think that is also under development. Sarah, is that true?
Yeah, so we do have a race, history of racism, social injustice related to race module for our GAIL case studies collection that soon we'll be releasing. So that is forthcoming from us in the next few months here. But I also think, when we think at GAIL, when we think about social justice issues and intersectionality, we even have like a public health archive that definitely provides exhibits in terms of the injustice that African Americans throughout history have gone through, just related to medicine and health and treatments. I mean, it's evidence and it's there. So things like that, even public health in modern America from GAIL, as well as some of our Archives Unbound collections around the history of racism, will provide some really great artifacts for discussion. But there's a lot of stuff out there, and I think what case studies aims to do is really kind of help curate sort of like the most relevant exhibits that might engage students in a helpful manner, so that as instructors like Dr. DeMuth, right, as you're teaching these courses and you're engaging students, you don't have to suss through 4 million pages of material to locate that. We can set you up with some key, I call it artifacts, key artifacts that will kind of help engage students and really kind of start the discussion and the critical thinking around some of these issues.
Yeah, and also in terms of intersectionality, thinking again about immigration and how immigration came together with anti-LGBT or LGBT discrimination, how those two things came together. There's also a case study specifically about hate crime statistics and the long fight really to get hate crimes against LGBT people documented. And that intersects a lot with race, and it intersects a lot with anti-trans violence. And so those things coming together and seeing them as connected to each other, I think is really important. Similarly with cross-dressing, that was also very much racially targeted as well. The violence connected there. So these things come together in lots of ways that I think are really important for us to recognize and help students to think about. It's helpful to think about them, in a very focused way, and then to build the connection to other categories, and how they come together.
That's great. Thank you. One of the other questions that's come through, and I know you talked a bit, and Sarah asked the question about how you partner with your library, right, around primary sources. For those librarians, I know we have some that are on the session here. What recommendations would you have from a faculty perspective for how librarians could provide further outreach or suggestions to support similar types of teaching methods for faculty at their institutions?
I think, liaison librarians know what it is the faculty are teaching, and I think often are called on in just a very particular way to as the instructors to helping students search through databases, show us how to find something in the library, but aren't asked enough about the material. So the liaison librarians know topic areas, and they have questions, and they know the research is out there. And one of the things that is helpful is that happens that librarians do is they tell us what's there. They know what's in the library, and know sort of connections. And I think it's really valuable to have librarians helping to develop assignments. They make them better every time. That's probably not an easy thing to say to professors. Like, I can make your assignment better, but it's true.
Yeah, no, I think that's important. I think one of the other questions, and I guess this is one more, and it's the last question we have here, but when you think about what you've provided to this point for your students and kind of outcomes, what do you think about moving forward? Will you continue to see you using these types of resources in your classes, regardless if it's hybrid, remote teaching learning environment, or back in the physical space?
Yes, I think, one of the things that has helped me so much in my research is the increasing digital availability of archival resources. So that has made it easier for my research. It's also made it easier for assignments for students. And so this moment that we find ourselves in, where things are online and remote more than they ever have been, almost entirely, right? I think we're going to find ourselves more, doing much more of that. So in this moment, I think we're learning more. We're forced to learn more about what's available to us. And I think it's going to forever change what it is we're doing in the classroom. I can just really see myself doing it more and more, and showing students the world that's available out there to them, beyond a simple Google search, right? There are all these curated materials that they can use that help them answer their questions. So yeah, I'm just going to personally be doing it much, much more in all of the classes that I teach.
That's great. Well, thank you again, Sarah, Dr. Demuth. Thank you very much. I think this has been a great discussion. And just to kind of close, we did want to let you all know that we have one other event coming up later today, and that's at 3 o'clock on interdisciplinary teaching. So that will be at 3 o'clock today, featuring Professor Carrie Rasan from the University of Connecticut. And we look forward to having you join us for that as well. So thank you very much, and stay safe out there. Thank you.
Thank you.